In 2023 alone, Bayley has 77 matches in total, with 3 draws, 7 wins, and 67 losses. This ultimately means she lost 87% of her matches, effectively making her one of the biggest losers in 2023. Bayley would go down as one of the greatest in WWE women's history. First ever Women's Grand Slam champion, longest reigning SmackDown Women's champion, and one of the first women to be a part of the first ever Iron Woman match in WWE history, while also being a part of the most iconic women's factions today in the 4 Horsewomen. And if you don't believe me, then just take a look at what she did for the company during the pandemic era. Not only was she carrying the company on her shoulder at the time, but she arguably had one of the greatest characters that came out of it. But this wasn't always the case, as she was initially forced to make a change to save her career. But though her change understandably helped in the long run, she still feels like such an afterthought, even in her own faction she created in Damage CTRL. But what initially makes her feel that way today? Let's talk about it. Not only is her win-loss record embarrassing enough, unfortunately, this isn't the first time she was getting embarrassed and shown as a joke on WWE TV. On May 29, 2017, Bayley was part of a segment in WWE that many would say is the worst segment in WWE history, the infamous This Is Your Life segment. For context, Bayley was in a feud with Alexa Bliss, and it was a pretty standard feud with some good matches and decent promos. But it all got out of hand drastically when Alexa Bliss decided to highlight Bayley's life in the cringiest way possible. She decided to interview Bayley's childhood friend, boyfriend, and teacher to initially humiliate Bayley. They would be talking about embarrassing stories such as Bayley bringing her dad to every date with her. And oddly, they loved embarrassing Bayley so much, the friend and ex-boyfriend even decided to make out with each other to add insult to injury. Not only was this highly awkward and embarrassing, but it felt like this effectively made Bayley become the biggest joke and punching bag for no reason. Some will say this was the exact moment that ruined Bayley's career, and arguably, like most, I would agree, but I think this was the beginning to her fall. Where I think she really fell off was the payoff of the same Alexa Bliss feud, where she had the option to turn all of this around but initially didn't. And that is when she refused to use a weapon in a weapon-sanctioned match. For further context, Bayley and Alexa Bliss was in a feud that was heating up, and the conclusion was a blow-off that resulted in a candlestick on a pole match, where the first person to grab the candlestick and use it first is the winner. Bayley was presented as a lovable underdog that will fight against any odds against her favor and initially keep fighting. But when the opportunity presents itself, she cowardly refused to fight back and was scared to use a weapon and let her own morals beat her when it mattered the most. This was the last draw that not only I had, but many of Bayley's biggest fans just grew tired of, and thus the rapid decline has ascended, with many of WWE Universe turning on her and booing her on a weekly basis. This would be a blessing in disguise, though, as she would debut a new and improved Bayley on the October 19, 2019 edition of SmackDown, becoming the role model we all adore and love today. But let's talk about what I think also tarnished her career even further and prompted me to even make this video in the first place, and that is Damage CTRL. When Bayley finally turned heel and decided to create her own faction to lift other women up, a lot of people such as myself praised this decision and thought it was a fantastic way not only to introduce new faces to the main roster, but to also showcase a new side of Bayley that everyone wanted to see. But even though that seemed like a good idea on paper, the execution wasn't what anyone could have expected. When the first initial formation of Damage CTRL, they were presented as a big threat to the women's division and a faction to be taken seriously. So much so they pushed them to the main roster immediately, feuding with the Raw Women's Champion in Bianca Belair. The EST of WWE rose in dominance with an impressive 420-day reign with the Raw Women's Championship. It was definitely remarkable and groundbreaking, and without a doubt would go down as legendary to her own accord. But the problem is WWE decided to put the newly formed Damage CTRL in the program with this unstoppable women's champion, which logically it sounded great for all parties involved, but then a massive undertaking became apparent, and that is who is going to take the loss. A, the current WWE Women's Champion who is on an impressive run, or B, the newly formed team that needs wins to feel credible as an actual team? The answer is John Cena. WWE thought it was a good idea to steal the outcome of the Nexus vs. Super Cena and paste it here. But the only thing here is that this would be the catalyst that stopped any liability for Bayley, as she was the one that was taking many of the losses in her feud with Belair. Not only did this make the main leader of her own faction weak, but it also moved the attention off of Bayley, and WWE decided to shift gears and invest in somebody else within the faction in Io Sky. On July 1st of 2023, WWE hosted their yearly Money in the Bank PLE. Whole gimmick being someone wins a briefcase that they can later cash in for a championship opportunity, ultimately adding prestige to their name if they cash it in successfully. WWE decided to have Io Sky win the opportunity, even successfully cashing it in on Bianca Belair to become the new women's champion. Not only did it put a light on Io Sky, rising star in WWE Women's Division, but it also added some prestige to Damage CTRL that they needed to become some sort of a threat to the rest of the locker room. Although the way she won, it kind of made Bayley appear lame in comparison, especially looking back at it now, where nothing allegedly came out of the finish other than a small little tease that the group was imploding, just for them to initially be okay a couple of weeks later. With the addition of Asuka and Kairi Sane, it made Damage CTRL powerful and better than ever. All would say they were the strongest faction in WWE history. But they didn't make it any easier for Bayley, as she was cast aside and didn't feel much like the leader anymore, while some will say Dakota Kai felt more like the leader than Bayley, and she didn't even have to wrestle, as she was out due to injury. And they made this abundantly clear when the members of Damage CTRL would have meetings without Bayley even talking in Japanese, making sure she was taken out of the conversation. Not only did this further the storyline against Bayley and Damage CTRL, but this was another addition to make Bayley feel like a joke and not the badass dominant role model that she once was. Not only was this the nail in the coffin, but it would ultimately get even worse when Damage CTRL was set to face Belair, Becky, Shotzi, and Charlotte in War Games. Not only was it the match of the night for most, but arguably this was one of the greatest War Game matches in recent memory. But that one stopped WWE from making Bayley a pawn, as she was the one to take the loss again. When Damage CTRL ultimately needed a win to add more prestige to their faction, as they were losing on a weekly basis leading up to the match. But maybe this is the reality that Bayley has to withstand while being one of the greatest women's wrestlers in the business. She's becoming the shadow in something she was once a part of. Hopefully this year she can finally break out and be in the conversation with her 4 horsewomen counterparts. Only time will tell.